Hi and welcome to today's session. Today's movie review time, and the one I decided to review today is I'm Not Your Guru by Tony Robbins. This movie was released in mid-July, and it's been trending quite a bit on YouTube, on Facebook, and of course on Netflix. So the movie, obviously I'm going to go with spoiler alert before we get into this. I forgot to do that when I was doing last week's movie review, because I'm going to go a little bit over the detail of what's covered in the movie. So it really kind of focuses on five main interventions or scenes. So the movie is really about following Tony's Date with Destiny program, which is one of the main seminars that he does that is 6 days long, and in which people from all over the world, about 2,000 people, pack into a room in different venues to receive help from Tony Robbins. Now, I like to preface this with, if you've seen any of my previous videos, that I did attend the event in Dallas. And again, that was one that was marked by about 27 people who had been burned during the fire walk. Now, what I mentioned also in that video is out of the 20 that got burnt, there was about 7,000 people who participated. So it's half of 1% that got burned, but it seemed to be what was mostly kind of highlighted in the news and highlighted on every kind of social media platform. It was just on how stupid the participants were in participating in this event, and they must have drank the Kool-Aid and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to try to give a more objective view, even though I have been to his UPW seminar. This one is about Date with Destiny. So it really focuses on 5 interventions. So there was a suicidal young man, and there was a 19-year-old girl with daddy issues. There was a suicidal woman who was part of the Children of God cult in Central America. There was a woman who was in an unsatisfying relationship with a partner who was, I guess we could say, a little bit more feminine. And the last one was a relationship issue with a man who wasn't being more in a manly role. So I guess what we can go is a little bit more on the positive and on the negative. So I'm going to start with the negatives first. The negatives is, I think as you watch this as an outsider, especially if you've never been to the events, it's easy to look at this and be really skeptical about what you're watching, whether or not it would be transformational, whether the effects would be lasting. I know a lot of people online had talked about the fact that, you know, you watch kind of the same thing with Dr. Phil and all that kind of stuff, and the power of the audience in terms of promoting change. And there is probably some validity to that, but what I found in watching the movie is more, I guess in a negative way, that it seemed like a really long infomercial with Date with Destiny. I personally would have liked a little bit more information about him and how he came to be, and a little bit more follow through in his life, and less about the event specifically, because again, I had attended the event, or a similar event, a shorter event. UPW is 3 days, where Date with Destiny is 6. But I wanted to have more of an in-depth view of kind of what made him tick. And although they had some clips of him and his morning routine and what he does in his own time in his beautiful home, there was less focus on him and more focus on what happens at a Date with Destiny event. Now, again, what I can tell you from the outside, when you look at this, it's kind of like, you know, man, these people are minions. Like, they just kind of follow like sheep in terms of what he does. But I guess what I could tell you from having attended the event is, when I was there on the first day, I thought very much like Joe Berlinger talked about himself, like in the first 3-4 hours that he was on the first day, he called his wife going, "What am I doing here? I don't know why I'm here. This is really weird." All that kind of stuff. And I think people who write reviews and haven't had the full experience, not from a Minions perspective, but just kind of the full experience. It's kind of really hard to kind of take away the same vibe as you get just watching the movie on its own. So I guess that's why I can bring you a little bit of a different perspective, having been to the event. Now, again, having said that, from a negative point of view, I really felt like it was a really long infomercial for his date with Destiny. So I was a little bit annoyed with that. I had a similar feeling at one of the days that we had attended, that the whole focus was on one of his training programs, and we were really hoping it was going to focus much more on information. It was more on information about the event. So especially when you've put in a 12-hour day, my girlfriend and I were a little bit frustrated that that last part felt more like an infomercial. So that's one of the things that I was left with when I watched the movie, is that it felt like a long infomercial. The second thing that I was just, I don't know what the right word would be, it was just surprised, astonished on how he confronted the girl to call her significant other. I just couldn't believe that he made her follow through, and that she actually followed through with the call. Now, they did the follow-up at the end of the movie saying that they were trying to reconnect and make it work. But I thought that was a little bit over the top, where kind of he's using his influence and the influence of the crowd to motivate a person to make a change when maybe perhaps they weren't ready to do so. Some people have also talked about his use of taboo language, and he does that in his videos on YouTube. If you downloaded any of his stuff, his infomercials and all that kind of stuff, there's less of the infomercials, but more of his YouTube videos, that he does use offensive language in his rationale, and he did the same at the live event that I went to. Is he talked about that it kind of grabs your attention in a different way. It's interesting because it's one of the strategies that I've really played away from in my own practice and working, especially with teens, because I look at it like with teens, I don't want to model a behavior that I wouldn't want or wouldn't think that would be appropriate. I understand the use of it, but it's one that I struggle with more. On the positive side, so those were a couple of the cons. On the flip side, I guess what I can say is I've recommended to a couple of my clients to just kind of watch the video and just kind of see how people can make choices to change their life, and it doesn't need to take a lifetime. Being a psychotherapist, sometimes the thought is that therapy needs to take years before people get well. And I think it's both my training in neurolinguistics programming and hypnosis that people can make changes quickly. It doesn't need to take years. It doesn't need to take, you don't need to rehack through your whole childhood in hopes of making progress in one little area. I remember one of the stories that when I went to see one of my coaches who lived in a small town in the US, he had said to me, when I got to his town, I had looked in the phone book and there was pages and pages of therapists, psychotherapists, or psychologists, I think was more specific. And the population of the town was like 76,000. Now, this was his way, this is not a personal view, but it was his way of saying it. And I said, but why is there so many therapists in this town? And he's like, well, it's pretty easy. They get 20 clients and then retire. And I said, what does that mean? He's like, well, they never get well. They keep seeing the same therapist for 20 years. And it was kind of like, wow. It was kind of an awakening for me, because he's like, people don't need a lot of time in order to get well. You can help people get well, hopefully in that same session, that they feel slightly better, not just because of the interaction with you, but you give them tools. So one of the things that I know that I've really strived for is to give my clients something at every session so that they can progress and move forward and make changes today, not in 5 years, not when all your issues are done and behind you. That's not to say that sometimes I don't need to deal with past issues. I mean, I do EMDR in my practice. I've done timeline therapy in my practice to look at those old issues. But a lot of times, even in those strategies, it doesn't take years in order to get to feeling well. And that was one of the messages that I took from the video too, or from the movie, is that he helps people make changes quickly, and that it doesn't need to take years. One of the moving things is, again, in terms of we talked before about the negative power of the crowd and how he would encourage people through the power of the crowd to make changes that maybe they didn't think possible. But I look at it also from the other side, where that young woman who was part of that cult, she received over $100,000 in donations from people just trying to help her out. And Tony talks a lot about that the true purpose in terms of getting to happy is about growth and contribution beyond self. So it's how do you give back? And again, that's the takeaway. How do you give back? I try to do that on a daily basis. Sometimes I think that I try my best to make an impact on the world. Sometimes it's one video at a time, sometimes helping one person at a time. But it's how can we make a difference in the world? And we don't live in a me society, we live in a we society. So it's everything looking beyond me. So overall, I enjoyed the movie. I Am Not Your Guru. Like I said, I've recommended it to some of my clients who I thought could really use a lift and see that change can happen quickly, not slowly. It was with a couple clients that had been struggling with issues for a while, and that they could just see that empowering change can happen quickly. So that's my review. I hope you enjoy it. I would love to hear your comments, thoughts, opinions. I'd like to have an exchange with you. I'd love to hear from you. So thanks so much for joining in. Have a great night, and we'll talk to you soon.